Once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar, Research Involving Subjects with Limited Capacity, IRB Expectations for Recruitment and Consent. We're excited to be discussing this topic with you today. I'm Ari Burgess, Quorum's Director of Client Relations. This is the second of two webinars on this particular topic, and overall this is our third webinar series this year. I'm also happy to announce that we did receive notification that this webinar qualifies for 1 hour of non-accredited CIP CE credits. So along with the slides and the other information that you'll receive at the end of the webinar, we'll be mailing out some information. You will receive a certificate of attendance that you can use as proof for your CIP credits. On that note, if you'd like to stay informed on Quorum initiatives such as our webinars, be sure to sign up for our mailing list. You can find this list by going to our website, www.quorumreview.com, and clicking on News and Events. The mail list sign up will be in the upper right-hand corner. This will ensure that you receive the latest e-news updates from Quorum, including Quorum's responses to FDA guidance, trends in clinical trial review, and our quarterly e-news publication, the Quorum Forum. Immediately following this webinar, we invite you to participate in a brief survey. This will help us know what kinds of topics interest you. It does help us continue to offer webinars that are current and informative, so at the end of the webinar, please do take a few moments to complete this survey. I'll be giving you a brief overview of Quorum before introducing our presenter, but first off, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Questions and answers. Do feel free to submit questions at any point during the webinar. There will be a chat box on your webinar dashboard. You can use that. Responses to your questions will be sent by our presenters within a few days following the webinar. Also, as I mentioned, the recording and the slide deck will be available. They'll be posted on our website within 5 business days of this session. We'll be emailing you a link with this recording as soon as it becomes available, and as I mentioned, we will also be emailing proof of attendance, which you can use either for your own internal processes or for CIP CE credits. And I would encourage you to feel free to share this link with your staff or any other colleagues that might be interested. I'd like to take a few minutes before we get started to talk briefly about Quorum Review. Quorum Review is fully accredited with the Association for Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, or AHRP, through 2014. Quorum is compliant with both the FDA and OHRP requirements. We do have 6 fabulous in-house licensed attorneys that provide both in-house regulatory guidance and can also be frequently found out speaking at industry events and providing thought leadership. Quorum has boards that are appropriately comprised to review studies in both the United States and Canada. And currently, Quorum is one of the largest central IRBs with over 180 employees, and of those IRBs that are of equivalent size, we remain the only one that's privately held. I'm also always proud to tell you about the number of our staff that have CIP certifications, certified IRB professionals. Currently, 60% of our affiliated IRB members, 40% of our regulatory staff, and 20% of our study manager and support positions hold this CIP certification. Quorum's turnaround times are among the best in the industry. We hold 14 convened board meetings each week, in addition to the expedited review staff who are continuously reviewing items during business hours. The number of meetings we offer allows us to offer to our clients 24-hour turnaround on site documents. That's from receipt of completed submission to posting approval documents on our portal. 36-hour review cycle for amendments and same-day site changes. To streamline site submissions, we also offer one-time CV and audit documentation submission. Among Quorum's founding principles was the customer experience. To support that experience today, we have staff available from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And each study with Quorum, regardless of size, will receive its own study manager. Additionally, Quorum offers a secure portal, and it's here that you can find all of your approval documents. You may also find different kinds of status reports, telling you where your items are, and our Smart Form site information questionnaire. Quorum's aware that there are special needs for Phase 1 and post-marketing studies, and we have special teams and processes for these kinds of studies. We do also work with hospitals and institutions and are able to support the unique needs of those types of facilities. And finally, we're aware that quality is supremely important for our customers, and we perform a 100% quality check on all our documents. Now I'd like to introduce today's expert presenter, Claire Carbary. Claire Carbary joined Quorum Review in September of 2009 as a regulatory attorney. Prior to joining Quorum, Ms. Carbary worked as regulatory analyst and legal intern at Western IRB. Ms. Carbary received her Juris Doctor from Seattle University in 2007 and was admitted to the Washington State Bar Association in the fall of 2007. In addition, Ms. Carbary is a member of the Health and Corporate Law sections of the WSBA. Ms. Carbary passed the CIP certification exam and has held her CIP certification since 2010. She currently serves as a member of Northwest Association for Biomedical Research, or NAWABR, and Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, or PRIMER. And now I'm going to transition the slides over to Claire.
Great. Thank you so much, Ari, for the introduction. We're really glad to have you all with us here today. This is an area of research that we get a lot of questions about, so we built the content today to try to address some of the questions that we frequently see from our clients, and I'm really hoping that this is something that helps to understand some of these complicated areas for those of you that are listening in, and perhaps even can be a resource when you're dealing with some of these issues in the future. You can come back to these slides and the recording and feel like you can make your way through some of these issues. So as you probably understood from the title of the presentation, we're talking today about research that involves subjects with limited capacity. So the first part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about research involving children, and I'm going to be doing an overview of the laws and regulations at the federal level and then also at the state level as it pertains to research involving children. And then the second part of the conversation will deal with research that involves adults that have limited capacity and would require someone to provide consent on their behalf. So getting started with research involving children. The issue of research involving children and the issue of children not being well represented in research is something that has been of concern to regulators for a long time. And in the late 1990s, the NIH developed a policy that was aimed at facilitating research that involved children due to this concern. The concern is that children were being given treatments that had been tested in adults, but there really was not enough knowledge about how these treatments affected children and what the risks were when they were given to children. So on this slide, you can see I've actually quoted a research policy document from Canada that has a similar sentiment. Really, that it's important to include children in research because we want to make sure that we're responding to their unique needs as children. So there's definitely a recognition industry-wide and by regulators that there is a need for appropriate research in children. On the other hand, there are a lot of restrictions to be cognizant of, both at the federal level and at the state law level, when you're conducting research in children. And so that's what we're really going to be walking through today. So you have a little bit of a tension there between wanting to include children in research and make sure that you're developing treatments that are effective and not overly risky for them, but also you have very protective rules in place that you have to be aware of. So starting with the federal level, and you'll see I've tried to include citations whenever I'm talking about the regulations or laws here, so that's helpful reference for you at the bottom of all of these slides. The citations at the federal level, really what we're looking at is FDA regulations and HHS regulations. And these regulations mirror each other as far as the type of research that's considered allowable that involves children. And there are several categories that of research that are allowable. And when an IRB is evaluating research that would possibly involve children, they have to find that the research fits into one of these categories. So I'm going to walk through those now. So the first category that's spelled out, and again the FDA and the HHS regulations, is the category of research that doesn't involve anything greater than minimal risk. And minimal risk is defined as, here on the screen you can see the official definition, that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort that's anticipated if you took part in the research isn't greater than that would normally be experienced or encountered in the daily life or during the performance of a routine physical exam or test. So that's to kind of ground us, because a lot of these categories center around this concept of minimal risk and whether the research poses greater or less than a minimal risk. So this first can't impose a risk that's higher than this threshold here. The other piece that has to be evaluated by the IRB is the second prong here on the slide. The researcher sponsors have to have made adequate provision for soliciting both the assent of children and the permission of a parent or guardian. And we'll talk in more detail about this concept of assent and the concept of permission for children to participate in research further down. Category 2, the second category of allowable research, is research that involves a greater than minimal risk but still presents the prospect of a benefit to individual subjects. And so in that first category, we don't talk about benefits at all because the risk is so low. Although the risk-benefit ratio ultimately has to be satisfactory to the IRB, and that's outside of these restrictions, there's sort of an assumption made that the risk is so low that the benefit may be none, and that would in theory be acceptable depending on the context of the study. So here we're looking at the risk is greater than minimal risk, but there's this prospect of direct benefit to the subjects. And so this is unpacked a little bit further in the regulation, and I've included the language here on the slide. The IRB needs to find that the risks are justified by the anticipated benefits of the research, and that risk-benefit ratio is at least as favorable as that's presented by alternative approaches. So if there's an approved drug that's out there for the condition that's under study, and it really has a better risk-benefit ratio than what seems to be offered by this study, that may be a problem. And then again, you still have to have adequate provisions made for that assent from the children and permission from parents and guardians under this category of research. The next category is research that involves greater than minimal risk and actually no benefit, but it's likely to yield knowledge about the disorder or condition, the subject's disorder or condition. So this is a category of research that's going to be conducted in children with a particular condition or disease or issue that's under study, because that's the way that they justify doing research that's greater than minimal risk and doesn't offer any possibility of benefit directly to the individual subject. So the risk, although it can be greater than minimal, it can only represent a minor increase over minimal risk. And that's not something that's further defined. So it's quite subjective, but certainly it's something that the IRB has to be cognizant of, that risk being only slightly higher than minimal risk. And then the intervention or procedures need to present an experience that's on par with the experience that the subject, the child, would be having in their actual or expected situation. So given the nature of their disease or condition, that's the context in which you're evaluating the experience that would be had if they were involved in the research. And again, you have to have adequate provisions for soliciting assent, and I have highlighted here that you actually have to have permission of both parents. There's some exception, which I'll discuss, or guardian for this category of research. So the IRB needs to find that that's the intent, is to solicit permission of both parents rather than just a single parent for this riskier research. Now, category 4 is something that we don't see as frequently, and it is research that's really not otherwise approvable under any of the 3 categories that we just talked about, but it does present an opportunity to understand, prevent, or alleviate a serious health problem that affects health or welfare of children. Now, this type of study, if this is presented to an IRB and they find that it doesn't actually meet any of those 3 categories, they actually, under the regulatory framework, need to disapprove the study and then send the study for consideration to the Commissioner of Food and Drugs or the Secretary of HHS, depending on which agency has jurisdiction of the study. Now, the IRB should make a finding at that time that they're evaluating the study that the research does present this opportunity for further understanding, and then ultimately disapprove the study and escalate it for evaluation. So the commissioner or secretary then needs to conduct an evaluation of the research, and that can be kind of a long process. It involves committees and whatnot. And they have to determine that the research either meets one of the categories, the first 3 categories, so the IRB essentially got it wrong, and in fact it does meet one category 1, 2, or 3 that we were just talking about, or they must agree with the determination that it doesn't meet any of those categories, but it does present this opportunity, as we've discussed, and they have to make a finding that the research will be conducted in an ethically sound manner. And again, we have this requirement that they have to find that there's an adequate provision made for soliciting assent and permission of the parents. Okay, so that kind of gives us an idea of what type of research is allowed in the U.S. when you're involving children. The next thing that you need to think about is whether or not you actually have children involved in your research. And sometimes that will be pretty obvious, and sometimes not. And that is where we can run into some questions. We certainly get a fair amount of questions about older minors and when they qualify as adults. So hopefully we'll get some clarity in the next couple of slides. So here is the definition of child under the federal regulations. It's a person who hasn't attained the legal age for consent to the treatment or the procedures that are involved in the investigation. And that's under the applicable law of the particular jurisdiction where the research will be conducted. So it defers wholly to state law, local law, about whether the person that you're considering enrolling is actually a child. Now, most states, as you're probably aware, set the age of majority at 18 or over. So once you hit that age, you can enter into a contract, you can make healthcare decisions for yourself. There are a few exceptions that I just want to call out here. It's not something that everyone is aware of. Alabama and Nebraska set the age of majority at 19, and Puerto Rico sets the age of majority at 21. And so one thing that can come up, and it certainly does come up, is when a protocol that's intended to be conducted across the country at multiple sites, it has an inclusion criteria that relates to age and indicates 18 and older. If it's unknown at the time that the protocol is approved, or it's known, that the research will be conducted in one of these states, then the IRB will have to be going through, if they're a central IRB, they need to evaluate for the research that's being conducted in the states, and certainly IRBs in these jurisdictions need to evaluate the research in the context of enrollment of children, unless they somehow are, as part of their approval, restricting the research to only adults. So if the intent is only to enroll adults, then it's preferable ultimately in that inclusion-exclusion criteria to indicate that and maybe not base it on age. But that is something that can make things a little bit complicated. So the other thing I would like to call out here is that in some states, again, this is something that people are probably aware of, minors that are age around 14, 15 and up can consent to certain types of medical treatment. And so this tends to be mental health treatment. There are lots of states that allow minors of a certain age to consent to treatment related to sexual health or pregnancy. And there might be notification requirements. I have an example here from Connecticut. Under Connecticut law, minors that are age 14 and up can consent to their own mental health treatment, but parents have to be notified within 5 days. This can become kind of confusing. I think we run into people sometimes that assume that once a minor female is pregnant, she's emancipated or considered an adult under state law, and that's really not the case. There are some limited jurisdictions that define it that way, but it's really important to be aware of kind of the spread of state laws, and it's really all over the place. Ultimately, if we go back to that definition of child, it relates to whether the child can consent to the treatments or the procedures that are involved in a clinical investigation. So this state law and consent to medical care versus research, these laws are really designed to allow adolescents to get access to treatment that they require, but it's access to treatment. So if your research involves a procedure or intervention that's not treatment, even if a lot of the research would involve treatment and there's only one intervention that shouldn't be really considered treatment, it's investigational, you're probably going to need parental permission unless that minor is legally emancipated, because these laws are really designed to allow them to consent to treatment but not research. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at research that could involve pregnant minors, for example. So the next thing that I want to talk about that certainly we get a lot of questions about and can be a hot topic in the context of IRB review is the issue of payment, advertising, and recruitment for these studies. So in that NIH policy that I mentioned earlier that was from the late 1990s, it was actually recommended that IRBs have a written policy about what they accept related to payments for research involving children, because it can be a kind of murky area and it makes some, a lot of people uncomfortable. So when it comes to designing compensation or reimbursement for a study that involves children, it's important to consider a few different things, and I'll just walk through those. The first is who is paid. So typically, most of the time, what we see is that the parent is paid. And typically that payment is actually not payment for the visits, but more of a reimbursement for the time, for the travel and whatnot. So ultimately the payment can be relatively high, but it actually relates more to the amount of time that's taken, parking, travel that's involved to get the child to a study visit. Certainly you want to be explaining if you're going to be offering up to a certain amount, and it might be something that would cause pause when it's under review by the IRB, how that relates to the amount of time that's involved, the procedures that are involved, and whatnot. The IRB typically isn't going to want to see that payment is discussed in the Assent document, that any sort of written document that's provided to older children. Though on the issue of payment, we do sometimes see small tokens of appreciation to children, so a little bag or stickers or things like that, and those are generally acceptable, but those are pieces that still need to be, the payment still needs to be reviewed by the IRB, so that's important to keep in mind if you're doing little giveaways and whatnot. The type of payment is also something that's important. So if you're giving a gift card to a particular store, such as a toy store, that could be particularly enticing for some children, and it might be something that's problematic from the perspective of the IRB. And in fact, some IRBs may have restrictive policies over what types of payments can be provided. So something to check with the IRB that you're using, do they have a policy about payments for research involving children or payments in general that you need to be aware of. Advertisements, of course, are also reviewed by the IRB. And it's important to think about avoiding emphasis on payments, and particularly with research involving children. Generally, an IRB may not want to actually see any advertisements that are targeted towards children, but for a study that involves older adolescents, depending on the context of the study, that could be appropriate. So you might be putting an advertisement on a patient support group or something like that, and with the knowledge that there will be some minors that are accessing the page and that you are actually wanting to enroll in the study. So if that's the case, you're required to provide the content of an advertisement and also where you're going to be posting it to the IRB. And so they'll be evaluating that and whether they think it's appropriate, given that minors would maybe be seeing it more than an advertisement in a newspaper or something like that. Understandability is something that's emphasized a lot in consent documents, but it's also important when you're advertising. And if you are going to be aiming something at a younger population, think about the reading level, think about making it as simple as possible. And then the last thing I just wanted to cover is the issue of therapeutic misconception. And that's a term that's used to describe the misunderstanding that people can have that participating in research is treatment. There are definitely studies out there that offer a possibility of benefit or improvement, but the protocol still is dictating how the subject is receiving the drug or the device or whatever, you know, the treatment that's offered is, that's part of the research. And so it's not designed to treat that individual and to respond to their individual needs. It's just, you know, it's designed to follow the protocol, the plan, the research plan. So it's of a lot of importance when you're asking someone to provide permission for their child to enter a study that they really understand, you know, what the actual possibility of benefits are, what the risks are, and they're not considering this to be treatment. It's, you know, especially in the context of people perhaps not having access to health care, you know, be aware of those issues and be aware that that misunderstanding is quite common amongst people that are considering research both for themselves and, of course, parents. Okay, so moving on now to the issue of assent. Assent is a child's affirmative agreement to participate in a clinical investigation. This is, again, the federal definition. And a child's failure to object is not something that should be construed as assent. So it's actually their affirmative agreement to be involved in the study. Now, assent under federal regulations is something that's required you know, as a default, when children are capable of providing assent, it's something that's required. There are certain circumstances in which the IRB can determine that it's not required, and that's when the capability of the children is so limited they couldn't be consulted, or in the case that the intervention or procedure that's involved does hold out the prospect of benefit, and it's important to the health or well-being of the child and available only in the context of the research. And in those two scenarios, then assent is not necessary. Under state law, there are a few laws that I was able to identify that relate to assent that I just wanted to call out here so you can kind of be aware. Most of these probably mirror either IRB policies or kind of what is generally considered to be true with respect to assent. So in California, the state law actually explicitly requires that if a subject is 7 years or older, they have to provide consent. I think that's generally an age where most IRBs would consider a child to be old enough to be consulted and to be asked to provide assent. Illinois says minors need to consent when considered capable, so that's in line with the federal regulations. Maine actually requires that subjects between the age of 12 and 18 provide consent unless they are unable to. And so, you know, that may be more restrictive, depends on how you interpret that. And then in Massachusetts, informed consent cannot be given on behalf of a minor who has refused consent. So that might be more restrictive. You know, even in the case where there's a possible benefit, if they've said no, under Massachusetts law, you can't enroll them in the research. The factors that the IRB should consider when determining whether assent is required is the age of participants. So you saw some state law actually specifically calls out ages where assent should be required. The maturity level and the psychological state of the individual subjects that might be enrolled in the study. So when the IRB has determined, or federal law or state law seems to require that assent be obtained, I just have a couple of points here about obtaining assent and things to think about. Written assent forms for ages that would typically be reading are generally going to be an expectation of the IRB. And keep in mind that the reading level should match the age of the participants that are going to read the form. So if you have a study that might involve very young children all the way up through adults, you may have 2 or even 3 assent forms that are age appropriate for the individual ages that would be looking at the form. You definitely want to consider including images to explain concepts. I think this is actually a great idea in adult consent forms, and I've seen some images that really help to simplify some kind of complex concepts. But certainly for children, this is a great idea. And, you know, considering an electronic-based approach to assent is something Electronic consent is something we're seeing more of. Anecdotally, in the studies where we've seen adolescents that are giving assent through an electronic platform, they've responded really well. They seem to understand the study better. You think about the fact that, until we're adults, we're not really presented with kind of dense written documents that we're supposed to be looking over. And so this is a way, if you're looking at an electronic format, to make it more accessible for minors. Then the last issue is signature or not. Again, IRBs may have a very strict policy one way or the other about this. It's important to keep in mind that if the subject is considered a minor under state law for purposes of the research, their signature is not a legally effective consent signature. However, for older minors, it's something that, they probably have an understanding of the significance of a signature, and it might help them to feel like they're more involved in the decision making. So I think maybe erring on the side of having at least your older adolescents signing an assent form is a good practice. So moving on from assent, I want to talk briefly about permission from parents or guardians. So as we noted with the categories of research, the IRB has to determine that the permission of the child's parents or the guardian is granted before they are entered into the research. For those first couple of categories of research that are allowed, the IRB can decide that the permission of just a single parent is sufficient. Otherwise, for that third and that more rare fourth category of research, permission of both parents is required. And as I mentioned, both parents, the signature is required except where the second parent might be deceased, unknown, incompetent, or not reasonably available. Reasonably available is not further defined, and IRBs may have different definitions of this that they've developed. We at Quorum tend to consider that to be someone who maybe is incarcerated and unavailable, perhaps active military duty and not reachable for a period of time. So if there's questions about whether the second signature is needed, if that's been required by the board, certainly I would contact the IRB and see what you think, but definitely document the rationale for not having that second parent signature if you are not able to obtain it at the time of consent. So just a couple of definitions here. Under federal law, permission means the agreement of a parent or guardian for the child to participate. A parent is a child's biological or adoptive parent, so that's not going to be a step parent. That can be kind of a complicated thing. It comes up in the course of trying to treat children and also certainly in the context of research, but something to just keep in mind. It's pretty clear there. And a guardian means an individual who's authorized under the state law or local law to consent on behalf of a child to medical care. So if under state law there's an individual or a body that has that ability to consent to medical care, they can provide consent to research under federal law, though there are some restrictions under state law, as we'll see. One other issue that comes up somewhat frequently is the issue of children who become involved in research when they're children and then become adults during the time that the research is ongoing. And when that happens, you're required to get the legally effective consent of that now adult to continue them into the research. And so that includes data collection. If you're still accessing records and collecting information about this person, you need their consent to do that. You may need to do that in a remote consent way, that there is a way to do that. Certainly you can contact your IRB about how to do that, but essentially you can have a phone call with them and discuss it over the phone, and then they can send the signed document via fax or scan it back to you. So it's not necessarily that you need to bring them in, but you do need to obtain consent. If this is something that you're anticipating, you're going to have 16, 17-year-olds and the study will be ongoing, I would highly recommend developing a consent at the beginning of the study when it's first considered that would be signed by those individuals. And so whether that's just the consent form that is initially signed by their parents, but it also has, signature lines that make it clear that it will also be signed by the child once they're older, or even a separate document. That's something that you kind of need to decide depending on the research and how, what would be involved later once they become adults. But try to develop those documents ahead of time, because it's no fun to scramble to try to get them created and approved once you actually need them. Another question that comes up pretty frequently is the issue of minor parents. And this can be kind of complicated. So, as I mentioned, some people assume that if a mother, even if she's a minor, is pregnant, she's considered emancipated under state law. And again, that's not the case always, or actually it's rarely the case under state law. So you get in this odd situation where if you're intending to involve a mother that's a minor in research, where she can consent for her child to be involved in the research, but not necessarily for herself to be involved in the research. And so there's some explicit laws that call out this right of the parent, even when they're a minor, to consent to health care. This can be kind of complicated when you're looking at certain studies. For example, it comes up a lot when we're looking at a pregnancy exposure type of study, registry data collection that would follow both the mother and the child. And the consent process and the consent documentation can be kind of complicated. So certainly work with your IRB and maybe do some legwork to try to figure out where you stand with respect to state laws. There's a lot you can find online as far as summaries of what the law allows in different states. So the last couple of slides here I'm going to cover relate to some more vulnerable populations of children, and there are further restrictions in addition to all of those that we've just been talking about for these populations. So the first is a ward, and that's a child that's in the legal custody of the state in some way under federal, state, or local law. So categories 3 and 4 of research, if you're dealing with that type of study, and it may involve wards, there's a couple of additional requirements. And the IRB can actually not approve the involvement of wards in research unless one of these conditions is met. So the research either needs to relate to their status as wards, or it needs to be conducted in a setting where the majority of children that are going to be subjects are not wards. And otherwise it's not approvable. So just keep that in mind. State law involving wards, states also recognize that this is a particularly vulnerable population, and there might be some quite restrictive laws. You'll see in New Hampshire that a guardian of the minor cannot actually consent to experimental treatment unless there's a court order approving it. So certainly be careful if you are going to involve a child that is a ward of the state in a research study, and work with the IRB to make sure that you have everything in place that you need to make sure that their involvement is appropriate. The next category of more vulnerable child is research involving neonates. And so research that involves a viable neonate after birth is just subject to the requirements that we've discussed previously. So if they're healthy, viable, it's subject to those restrictions. Certainly you're evaluating the risk in the context of their age, but otherwise there are not additional restrictions. When you're involving neonates that are either of uncertain viability or non-viable, there's a lot of additional requirements that we'll just walk through here briefly. So the first is that where appropriate, you have to have had some preclinical or clinical studies that provide data assessing the potential risks to a neonate. The individuals that are providing consent need to be fully informed regarding the impact on the neonate, and the individuals that are engaged in the research, so the researchers, sponsored personnel, any of the SMO personnel, they can't have any part in determining the viability of the neonate that would be involved in the research. So it has to be completely separated. When you're looking at neonates of uncertain viability, you can see the restrictions here on the left side of the bottom part of the slide. So it has to potentially enhance the probability of survival to the point of viability. So that's kind of a high threshold. And that any risk is the least possible for achieving that objective, or it has to be research that would develop important biomedical knowledge that you really couldn't obtain in another way. You can have consent of one parent in this circumstance, though again you might have IRB or institutional policies that would require both. Moving on to non-viable neonates, there are a number of other requirements here that I've listed. So that vital functions can't be maintained artificially for the research can't terminate the heartbeat or respiration, there can be no added risk to the neonate resulting from the research, and the purpose needs to be important biomedical knowledge that you couldn't obtain otherwise. Note here on the bottom of the slide that consent of both parents is required unless you've got one of the exceptions that we previously talked about, but that's the default. And you can't have consent or permission by a representative, so it has to be the parents when you're dealing with this population of children. One last thing I want to talk about before we move on to the second part of the presentation is sample collection and genetic testing in research involving children. And so it's just something that is coming up more and more as an issue of concern. So we know we've seen over the past year or 2 years that researchers have actually been able to re-identify individuals based on, you know, a pretty limited amount of information in some of their genetic information. So they've been able to find some information that's online about people and information about their genetic sequence and actually re-identify. And this would have completely been considered de-identified previously. But they've really shown how possible it is to identify people with a really small amount of information. We can really only assume that it's going to become easier and easier to identify people, especially given the amount of information that is out there about any given individual online. And we can also assume that, you know, people who are children right now over the course of their life will have, you know, just a huge amount of data and information available about them as they become older. And by the time they're adults, it'll really be potentially quite a lot of info that you could find about a given individual. So the other side of this is we don't know. We know now what we can see from looking at tissue or information about someone's tissue, but we don't know what kind of genetic markers might be discovered in the future. We really just don't know what kinds of things that you could be able to tell just by looking at someone's tissue or data about them. So it's important to be cognizant of that risk that's kind of unknown of, and there's really a lot of growing concern about this, and there are some state laws that impact genetic testing. I've included an example here. In Arizona, you cannot do genetic testing on minors unless you have the written informed consent of the minor. And so it's important to be cognizant of the fact that there's going to be state laws potentially passed about this. There's a lot of growing concern, and to really closely look at any long-term storage that you're going to be doing with specimens that you take from children, or genetic testing that's part of the research that you would be conducting. And think that through and think about how you're going to protect and hold the information and communicate that to the IRB, because they are aware of these things and they are going to be probably asking more questions when you are going to be storing samples for a long period of time or doing genetic testing. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of research involving children. And I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation discussing the issue of research with incapacitated adults. And this slide covers the regulatory landscape in the United States when it comes to research involving incapacitated adults. And I want to pause here. When I'm talking about an incapacitated adult, and we'll talk a little bit, we'll get into this in more detail, but not talking about someone who's illiterate, can't read the consent form, and would require someone to read it to them. I'm talking about someone who actually does not have the cognitive capacity to understand what the research is about, to consent to the research for themselves. So just want to draw that distinction. That was a question that came up on Tuesday after someone listened in to the presentation. So just to be clear here. So in the U.S., we do not have federal regulations like we do about research involving children for research involving adults that need an LAR. We have, some part of the regulations speak to this, but we don't have restrictions on what type of research is allowable under a regulatory requirement. There were some regulations that were proposed in the 1970s, but they were never finalized. You'll see here that the Nuremberg Code, which is one of the first modern ethical documents about research that came out of World War II, and then the trials of the Nazi doctors, actually was so restricted that it only allowed research where a subject could consent for themselves. Now that was so restrictive, it was ultimately never adopted in its entirety by any country. The guideline that is sort of the go-to when it comes to providing guidance on research with incapacitated adults is the ICH GCP. And this is something that is a guidance that's been adopted by U.S. agencies, but it's not something that is part of our regulatory framework. So we will be alluding to that as we walk through this conversation. So the ICH GCP talks about allowable research involving adults that require an LAR. And they focus on non-therapeutic trials. So in general, if the trial has some possibility of benefit and a person can't provide consent for themselves, it's considered, it's considered allowable. It doesn't require as much scrutiny. Certainly you have to look at all of the risk-benefit ratio and all of those factors. The ICH GCP focuses on a non-therapeutic study that would be conducted in subjects with consent of a legally authorized representative. And so they want to see that the following conditions are fulfilled. They want to see that the objective of the trial can't be met by a trial where subjects could give informed consent. They want to see that the foreseeable risks are low, that the negative impact on the subject's well-being is minimized and low, the trial is not prohibited by law. That's something that we would always want to see, but there it is. And then ultimately that the IRB or Ethics Committee expressly determined that the inclusion of these subjects is acceptable. So that's something that you'd like to see if you're following ICH GCP, that the IRB is making a determination, is it appropriate to include this type of subject in the study, anytime they're considering a study that may involve an adult that needs an LAR. Now, the other thing here, just at the bottom of the slide, is that participants need to be closely monitored, and ICH GCP requires that they be withdrawn if they're unduly distressed by their participation in the research. So as far as how to assess capacity, the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, in a report, has a hopeful quote here that it's generally agreed that if you're trying to figure out whether someone who might be involved in the study has the capacity, you can't do that with just a mental status assessment. You really need to develop and present the material about the study and evaluate whether they can understand and appreciate that information. So, and that should be documented in the research record, the process that you go through. Not to say that you can't do a general mental status assessment as part of that as a tool, but really you should be assessing their ability to consent to the particular research. Sometimes you might be approaching an individual to participate in something that really doesn't involve a lot of intervention, would just involve data collection or something, and they may have capacity to consent to that, but ultimately something that would be more complicated, they wouldn't be able to make a decision. So really thinking about it in the context of the study is important. As you may have seen, if you're involved in research involving these types of subjects, that a protocol can sometimes dictate the tools or the process that should be used. That doesn't mean that you can't add to that process. but sometimes you'll see a particular MMSE score that's required, or something else that they'd like to see as a benchmark in order to enroll someone. This assessment needs to be conducted by the person obtaining consent, and it's something to consider, especially with a higher risk study, doing an independent capacity assessment, having another provider come in and do that assessment and documenting that. So when you're doing capacity assessment, there's different approaches that can be taken. The first would be to evaluate, can they evidence a choice and express their preference? And if you can't get past that, perhaps they don't have the capacity really to be involved in this study. Now, draw a distinction here between the fact that if their choice is no and them not being able to actually decide. The next is whether they have the ability to understand the relevant information. Can they appreciate the situation and its likely consequences? And then can they manipulate the information rationally and really kind of understand if this, then that? So those are different evaluations that should be made when you're looking at the capacity of an individual to enter into the study and to decide whether they should enter into the study. Here's a state law definition of capacity. I think it's a good one. It's from Idaho. Any person that has sufficient intelligence, awareness to understand the necessity of, the nature of, and the risks involved in a medical treatment is competent to consent to the treatment. That is specific to treatment, but it's probably applicable to research as well. So once you've got a study where you probably will have people requiring an LAR and it's allowed by the IRB and it's been approved to do that, you have to figure out who is an appropriate LAR. And so federal law tells us that a legally authorized representative is someone who's authorized under applicable law. So again, we're kind of thrown to the state law to figure out, okay, who is the person that can provide consent to this person's involvement in the research? Oh, and also just family member is defined as well. It's kind of as you would expect, but often, as you probably know, the LAR would be a family member. So when we're looking at state law and LARs for incapacitated adults, all of the states have laws that speak to the order of authority for persons that can make a medical decision on behalf of another person. Very few have anything relating to consent to research, however, although there are several state laws we'll talk about that restrict a person's ability in certain circumstances to consent to research. So I've included on this slide sort of a general order of authority for consent under most state laws, though there are some things that are switched around depending on the state you're looking at. So the first thing that trumps everything is an agent or a guardian that has the authority to make a healthcare decision. And if that's a healthcare power of attorney, advanced healthcare directive, that person, if it's not the spouse or domestic partner, that trumps even that relationship. In the absence of that, you're really beholden to the order that's dictated under state law. So typically it starts with the spouse or domestic partner, then adult children, the custodial parent, an adult sibling, grandchild, and available adult relative with the closest degree of kinship. So in the absence of any of these other people, it could be someone that's actually quite remote from you that ultimately could make a decision on your behalf. Keep in mind also that there are multiple people that are at the same level that, they all need to agree. So if a person has several children, doesn't have a spouse, and then one person is opposed to them being involved in the research, you are probably not going to be legally able to enroll that person in the study, unless one of their children is designated as that agent, as I explained earlier. And then also keep in mind, this is a really rapidly changing area of the law, that there are a lot of jurisdictions in the U.S. that allow either civil unions or same-sex marriage. So I've listed the ones as of the printing of these slides where that's allowed, and that can, is something to pay attention to if you're in one of these jurisdictions as to who would potentially be able to provide consent. If you're not in one of these jurisdictions and someone has a partner but it's not legally recognized, then it may be that the adult child ultimately has the authority to make this decision. Again, that's unless the partner, even if there is no legal recognition of their union, if there's a written healthcare power of attorney, then they would have the authority to make that decision. So this can be quite complicated, certainly in the context of treatment, but also in the context of research consent. So as I mentioned, there are some state laws that speak to permission for incapacitated adults. And they're restrictive because, it's considered to be a vulnerable population and require additional sort of hoops that you would need to jump through in certain circumstances. So particularly you can see here, I'm not going to run through all of these because I know we're getting close on time, but that particular individuals, so developmentally disabled individuals, and then really when you're seeing residents that are in a state-operated mental health institution, there are restrictions under a lot of state laws, and this is just some examples listed here of what you might see that would require either a court order or an independent consultant or a non-affiliated interdisciplinary team to be involved in deciding whether it's appropriate for that person to be involved in the research. So be aware, state laws can be quite restrictive, especially if you might be doing research in a facility where people are living. When we're talking about recruitment, a lot of the same issues that come up with children are an issue when you're looking at research with incapacitated adults. When you're advertising, you might be ultimately reaching a care provider but not the legally authorized representative. So that's something to try to kind of identify, I think, early on in the process and talking with a person. Because you may have a care provider that's very excited and interested, but the person who makes the decision ultimately under your state law will, it won't be something that they would allow. Support groups, either online or, in-person meetings are a place that often might be successful, but, thinking about the nature of the advertisement and how you approach people is important to be both from a practical perspective of being effective advertising, and also, the IRB is going to be sensitive to how you're reaching out to these individuals. Payment, definitely considering logistics for these people getting an individual that doesn't have capacity to study visits. Thinking about ease of access to the site and parking and whatnot is really important. And again, that issue of therapeutic misconception is definitely something that comes up in these studies. Whenever you're asking someone, please enroll your loved one, this person that you're responsible for taking care of in this study, and if they have hope that the person's condition might improve, they may be sort of grasping at the research as that. And it's important to kind of keep them in check with some reality. There hasn't been anything ultimately that's been tested, even though there have been hundreds of drugs tested for treatment of Alzheimer's, and several have failed. They've all failed. So just keeping in mind that while the study is being pursued because there is some promise, the reality is that there are lots of drugs and treatments that don't make it beyond initial testing or even beyond phase 3 testing. So it might be helpful to kind of talk about some of those statistics to get a little bit of a reality check. And I know I have a few more slides, so I just want to acknowledge that we are a little over. It should take about 3 more minutes if you can stick with us. Assent for adults requiring an LAR is another thing that I wanted to cover. Again, we're back to ICH GCP, and ultimately, that's what we have to look to about whether or not at the federal level, what's our guidance in general. And so when it says here, when a trial includes subjects that can be enrolled only with a LAR, so that's for minors and also adults that couldn't consent under ICH, They need to be informed to the extent compatible with their understanding, and if capable, they should sign and personally date the informed consent. So that's maybe not the legally effective signature, just as with children. However, there's some recognition that people understand the significance of a signature, and it gives them the opportunity to really say yay or nay, to provide their assent, at least, to be involved in the research. There's some state laws, again, about assent for adults that would require an LAR, and also dissent. And so, again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but just keep in mind that you will have state laws that speak to this issue, and they may, specifically in the context of mental health patients that are, those that have been involuntarily committed to a mental institution, there might be some restrictions to be aware of. Okay, so just to conclude, as I said in the beginning, we know there are a lot of considerations when you're looking at research that would involve a proxy consent for children or adults that don't have capacity. We wanted to try to raise awareness, maybe answer some questions about the requirements and the ethical issues that can arise, both when you're designing the research and then also when you're looking at recruiting and consenting folks to be involved. So thank you so much for your time. Apologize for going over by a couple minutes, but we are happy to have you and look forward to the next one.
So thank you, Claire, for preparing and presenting the information on this topic. I'd like to let our viewers know that if you have additional questions, there will be an opportunity to submit those by survey at the end of this webinar. Alternatively, you can email your questions to clientrelations@quorumreview.com. We'll be doing our best to follow up individually or answering the questions in a Q&A on our website. I'd like to take another moment to remind you again that the webinar recording, the slide deck, and the Q&A will be posted on our website. And if you missed the announcement earlier, this webinar does qualify for an hour of non-accredited CIP credits, CE credits. So we'll be emailing a proof of attendance along with the link to these other items. We'll be emailing these links out as soon as they become available. And one more final plug for our survey. Please do take the survey that will occur as this webinar ends. Don't close your browser. As the webinar recording finishes, the survey will pop up, and it'll only take a few moments. It's about 5 questions, and it does help us provide feedback as to what we should be presenting next. And once again, I would like to thank you for attending. We here at Quorum Review are very grateful for your participation. We hope you found this topic informative and useful. If you're interested in learning more about Quorum, do visit us at quorumreview.com. You can also find us on the following social media outlets: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Google+, and SlideShare. And on behalf of everyone here at Quorum, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.